In October 1962, the United States discovered something that was never supposed to exist. Soviet nuclear missiles, just 90 miles from its coastline. For 13 days, the world stood closer to nuclear war than at any other moment in history. The Cold War was a period of intense geopolitical rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, beginning after World War II and lasting until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It was not a traditional war, but a struggle for ideological, economic, and military dominance. Both superpowers competed through nuclear weapons development, espionage, propaganda, and technological rivalry, including the space race. By the early 1960s, tensions were already high. In April 1961, the United States backed the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, an attempt to overthrow Cuba's revolutionary leader, Fidel Castro. The failure pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union and convinced its leaders that another U.S. invasion was likely. In response, U.S. planners launched Operation Mongoose, a covert campaign aimed at destabilizing Castro's government. From the Soviet perspective, Cuba was vulnerable and an opportunity. In the summer of 1962, the Soviet Union began secretly constructing missile sites in Cuba. U.S. intelligence initially detected a general Soviet military buildup, including the arrival of Il-28 bombers during routine surveillance flights. On September 4th, President John F. Kennedy issued a public warning against the placement of offensive weapons in Cuba. Despite the warning, on October 14, 1962, a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flew over western Cuba. The photographs it captured revealed something unmistakable: construction sites for medium and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles. The images were analyzed by the CIA at the National Photographic Interpretation Center. The conclusion was clear: Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed and could become operational within weeks. The intelligence failure was not that the missiles existed, but that they had nearly been completed before discovery. On October 16th, CIA Director John McCone briefed President Kennedy and his closest advisors. Maps showed missile ranges capable of striking much of the continental United States. The president formed a secret advisory group known as XCOM. Inside the room, opinions were deeply divided. Military leaders, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued for immediate airstrikes followed by a full invasion of Cuba. Others favored diplomatic pressure. Kennedy chose a middle path. On October 22nd, he ordered a naval quarantine, deliberately avoiding the word blockade, to prevent further Soviet weapons from reaching Cuba. That evening, Kennedy addressed the nation on television, revealing the CIA's findings and warning the Soviet Union that the United States would not tolerate offensive nuclear weapons so close to its borders. Behind the scenes, tensions escalated rapidly. On October 26th, Kennedy privately told advisors that only military action might remove the missiles. But that same day, an unexpected message arrived. ABC News correspondent John Scully reported that a Soviet intermediary suggested a deal. The missiles would be removed if the United States promised not to invade Cuba. The next day, matters became even more dangerous. A U.S. U-2 aircraft was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot. Meanwhile, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent a second message demanding the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The White House faced its most dangerous moment. Unknown to the American leadership at the time, one of the most dangerous moments of the crisis was unfolding beneath the Atlantic Ocean. On October 27, 1962, a Soviet submarine, B-59, was detected near the U.S. naval quarantine line. American destroyers, unaware that the submarine was armed with a nuclear torpedo, began dropping practice depth charges as a warning signal. Inside the submarine, conditions were extreme. Communication with Moscow had been lost. Temperatures were rising. Crew members believed that war may have already begun. Under Soviet protocol, launching the nuclear torpedo required the agreement of 3 officers on board. 2 of them agreed. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. Arkhipov argued that the explosions were signals, not an attack, and that launching the torpedo would almost certainly trigger nuclear war. His decision prevented an escalation that could have ended millions of lives. At the time, no one in Washington or Moscow knew how close the world had come. That night, President Kennedy made a calculated decision. Publicly, the United States would accept the first Soviet offer, the removal of missiles from Cuba, in exchange for a non-invasion pledge. Privately, Attorney General Robert Kennedy met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. He assured him that U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey would be removed, but quietly and without public acknowledgement. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that Soviet missiles would be dismantled and withdrawn from Cuba. The immediate crisis was over. The naval quarantine continued until Soviet Il-28 bombers were removed. In April 1963, U.S. Jupiter missiles were quietly withdrawn from Turkey, just as promised. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed that history is not only shaped by presidents and generals, but also by individuals whose names are rarely known. In response to the crisis, a direct communication line, the hotline, was established between the White House and the Kremlin, reducing the risk of future misunderstandings. The world survived the Cold War's most dangerous moment not because of weapons, but because restraint prevailed, sometimes in silence, sometimes deep beneath the ocean.